I don't know if I'm your last speaker or not, but I'm probably standing between you and dinner or a flight or something like that. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes, and then I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a bit of a conversation. It is really good to see all of you again, and some of you in the room I've had an opportunity to meet with one-on-one. Some people I've visited community. Certainly I met with a number of people over the last couple days. I want to thank the National Chief and Executive for not just having me here, but for our ongoing relationship and our honest conversations. And I think that's where I'd like to begin, is that it's through that truth and honesty, even when we don't agree, even when there's challenges, that we're actually moving the bar forward. And I do think we are moving the bar forward together. So thank you very much for your leadership, National Chief and Executive. And thank you very much to the many elders in the room who I know have been guiding us in a good way. Today, as you know, and I think many speakers will have reflected on this, we received horrendous news out of Winnipeg this week. And you know, the first job that I did for the federal government, I was elected in 2015. I was a community activist. I worked in the issues of substance use policy, housing, homelessness, vulnerable people, youth development. And I went into federal politics because I felt that I was not making a difference in the community as fast as I would have liked to see. National Chief, you know the situation on the ground in Thunder Bay and probably so many communities across the country where the most vulnerable people are the people that have been harmed by a colonial system and a colonial oppressive system that has systematically, for example, discriminated in terms of child welfare, but in many ways have used tools of oppression that have resulted in significant and lasting harm for Indigenous peoples. Not just in the conceptual way that we often talk about it, but in the day-to-day grind that so many people face, just trying to make their way through what I would say a legacy of trauma that has led to really unlivable and unsustainable circumstances. And to hear a little more and to learn a little bit more about Linda Mary Beardy, you can see all of that come together in the life of a particular person. You know, the experience of either being a residential school survivor, a 60 scoop survivor, the descendant of people who have survived that kind of trauma, the ongoing grind of poverty, the exclusion of Indigenous peoples from decision-making processes, from rights that are inherent, all culminate in the death of Indigenous people in disproportionate rates, whether it's through violence, acts of violence, like I am certain Linda Mary Beardy faced, not just in the incident that led to the loss of her life, but probably sustained, or whether it's in the deteriorating health conditions that come from lack of access to things like equitable care, health care, lack of access to equitable education and opportunity, and lack of access to economic self-determination, whether it's through employment or through economic development on lands that have been, since time immemorial, Indigenous peoples. And that's what we're trying to work to fix together. And I sit in a place of the role of the colonizer. You can imagine how that is a challenging place to be as someone who cares deeply about rights and equity and social justice. But it is also important work that I have an opportunity to do together. And big work happened, actually, today and over the last several days in the area of coming to terms and reconciling with some of those colonial practices that led to that harm. And I want to congratulate and thank the many voices of advocates and leaders, survivors and family members that continued to insist on justice for children, that led to the support of the Chiefs Assembly of the proposed final settlement agreement on compensation. And this new deal is, as you know, now totaling $23 billion. And as I said to many media reporters, you know, they asked me, should Canada have settled earlier? And unequivocally, we shouldn't have been in a position where we needed to settle at all. There should have been fairness and equity from the very beginning. Because if we truly believe that everyone deserves a fair chance to succeed, we can't starve people of the opportunity through discriminatory and racist practices. So now we have a compensation plan that will go in front, of course, of the CHRT first and then the federal courts. And I want to specifically thank Regional Chief Woodhouse, besides yourself, of course, National Chief, Dr. Blackstock, the many parties at the table, the representative plaintiffs, the officials that have stuck with it, in particular Val Gideon. Many of you will know Val, who has been working at this far longer than I have and is a champion. And it's the persistence and courage of all of those names and the many more that I don't know that inspires me to be persistent and courageous and say the hard things all the time. The next step is also to continue with the long-term reform of the Child and Family Services and Jordan's Principles program so that we don't see that kind of discrimination into the future. That work will continue. The money is set aside and designated to be able to do that work, and that system will be Indigenous-led and designed. And I think that will change the way that child welfare is delivered through the department. Of course, there is also much work happening in terms of inherent rights for self-determination and child welfare. And I'm excited to go up to KI next week to sign a coordination agreement in that community. My department is working on two key pieces of legislation right now, and I'm sure you've all heard about those pieces of legislation. And quickly, the first piece is on water. We had a powerful reminder just a couple of weeks ago of the importance of protecting the water when we heard the terrible news of the tailing pond leak in Curl Lake. This leak has affected the lands of the Athabasca Chipewyan and the Mikisew Cree First Nation. I've spoken with both chiefs of those communities, and there's devastation. Devastation and hurt at the harm that it's caused, the fear that it's causing community members, the animals that depend on the water and the land, and what this means in terms of access to food into the future, as there is all of those uncertainties swirling around. My department is working with Environment Canada and other colleagues federally to support the Athabasca, Chipewyan and Mikisew Cree First Nation with access to clean water in the interim, with the testing support that will help people understand the extent of the contamination and any other needs that they identify. But it's a really powerful reminder about how cleaning contaminated water is not easy, nor is it clear-cut, and sometimes, at least with the current technology we have, it's not even feasible. And the lands, animals, and people are counting on us to do a better job to protect the life that water represents. So we've had a really good partnership with the AFN on the proposed legislation, and I want to thank the AFN and Regional Chief Woodhouse and National Chief for sticking with Canada through a difficult process. We had some bumps in the road, as you can well imagine, but we did take time to reset and pause and come to what I would say are some guiding principles for what it would look like to actually work together. Sometimes the word co-development is thrown around and people are not really certain what exactly that means. And I think the pause that we took to define what co-development meant and to define what our partnership could look like and to define how we would work together has led us to the point where we have this legislation in place now. It's out for consultation, as you know, across the country. It's the first time in the history of the country that legislation has been published before it hits the floor of the House of Commons for the express purpose of giving people, individual communities, nations an opportunity to feed into how that legislation can be perceived to be protecting water, what needs to be strengthened in the legislation, and all of those suggestions and changes will go back to the working committee to make sure that the changes that are accepted and included are accepted by actually the AFN and the working group, as well as the parties working on the drafting. I know I'm running over probably what people are expecting. We've also been engaging, as I said, with First Nations rights holders, which includes modern treaty and self-governing nations and First Nations organizations on the consultation draft. The proposed legislation aims to address key First Nations considerations in terms of legislation that they would like to see. So these quickly are recognition of rights, sustainable funding for services, national standards for drinking water and wastewater, proper protection of source water, and the need for ongoing engagement on water issues that affect First Nations. So I'm looking forward to the next steps, and I think this could be a very pivotal piece, a tool that will protect water for the next generations, and I'm very excited to see what happens in our process together. The other legislative work underway is through Bill C-38, which was introduced in December of last year. It proposes amendments to address some of the remaining inequities in the registration and band membership provisions of the Indian Act. We all agree the Indian Act is a colonial piece of legislation, and some changes have been made, but people want more. Bill C-38 is one small piece towards the changes that people envision. It seeks to ensure First Nations individuals with family histories of enfranchisement are entitled to registration under the Indian Act and can pass this on to their descendants to the same degree as those families without disenfranchisement. The legislation is part of the commitment that we made to reach a legal agreement outside of the courts for the 15 plaintiffs represented in the Nicholas Charter Challenge. And as I've heard from many of you, this bill doesn't go far enough. And so to understand how to continue to right these historic wrongs in a way that supports families and communities and inherent rights, very shortly we'll launch the co-development of a collaborative process for engagements on second-generation cutoff and Section 10 voting thresholds. And this progress will be inclusive and flexible enough to allow for the changes to be made to the Indian Act that will address these outstanding inequities in a way that is thoughtful, inclusive, and fair. And so for both bills, I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts as we work through that together. I know that the focus of this Special Chiefs Assembly has been on the United Nations Declaration National Action Plan, and I know that many of you have thoughts about how we can strengthen the action plan and work together to ensure that it reaches its full promise. Minister Lametti is coordinating this work, but there are some very specific, significant areas that fall under Indigenous Services Canada. Ultimately, it's my hope that better working structures that recognize self-determination and rights will result in better outcomes. It lays out what we will do and how we will do it in partnership. And this is the transformational and generational work that will help us advance rights together. A couple of the areas that I think are going to be a focus for Indigenous Services Canada in the action plan and where work is already underway are on the rights around health and health access. You all know about Joyce's principle that recognizes that Indigenous peoples have the right to fair and equal access to health care services that are high quality, culturally safe, and free from racism and discrimination. But you all know that promise is not being lived up to right now. That far too many people are still facing extreme systemic discrimination and racism in healthcare systems. And that's why when the Prime Minister announced the new bilateral agreements with provinces and territories, he simultaneously announced a $2 billion health equity fund that will roll out in a self-determined way to First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples across the country to continue to pursue health equity, to continue to work, support the work that's happening all across the country on self-determined health legislation. And I think that's where the real promise lies. So it's structural work that we'll do together on health. The other two areas that I think the Indigenous Services Canada Department feeds into the national plan are on economic reconciliation. And you heard I heard the tail end of Minister Miller talk about some of the elements of how to stimulate that more quickly, and on self-determination. Our intent is to co-develop these pieces of work together so that we can truly live and breathe the nothing about us without us premise that it underlines the principles of co-development. So in closing, and I feel a little rushed because I had so much more to say, but I know there's many questions, I think we're doing some really important, some really difficult work together. And I look forward to continuing those honest conversations, National Chief, with you and your executive, and certainly all of you in the room as we move forward. It's through those hard things that you say to me that I actually get good ideas and I can actually push my department. So miigwech, thank you, merci. I'm very, very honored to be here. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Minister Patty Hajdu. So we do have just a few minutes. I'm looking online. I don't see anybody, but I see two on the floor. I see three. With that, I'll have to close the speakers list. But microphone number one. Go ahead, please.
Miigwech, Chair. Josh Kwanekut Dego, Bijio Dotem, and not the Kamegwaning, and Ishinabe. Warren White, Counsel for Nutkamegwaning, proxy for Chief Cabestra. As I added my words to your counterpart, treaty right to education, In your words and your presentation, Minister, I don't know how many times you said rights, the rights. But I want to remind you that, again, 150 years of Treaty 3 this year. And our school is part of treaty rights to education. Our school is 42 years old. The national chief walked in there. Not adequate. It's long-lived its life. So we sent a letter to Trudeau to honor the obligations in treaty where a chief may ask or will ask for a school for education in the treaty. We sent that letter in October. We have not gotten a response. I know for a fact from your, I won't name names, but your bureaucrats have told me this week there's no money for schools. So again, the breaches of treaty are again on our children, the future of their education, the inequities of a good school compared to us away from our community. We are losing our children, our youth, our teenagers to other schools because we can't provide the adequate education that needs. So I don't know when the time is going to come where the honor of the treaty, right to education for a new school in our community, 42 years in the making, will happen. I just wanted to remind you that, Minister. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you. Microphone number 2.
Chief Marshal Head Sholik, Cree Nation. Yesterday, Mr. Hajdu, I got cut off in addressing the housing issue. But the part I missed out to tell you, Section 95 under CMHC doesn't really work for my First Nation. There's a whole bunch of policy, a lot of red tape that we have to go through to qualify for Section 95. And I told you yesterday that we have a long list of people waiting to get houses in my community. I told you specifically yesterday that those people that are living off reserve are paying rent under the provincial system. They want to come home to Shoal Lake. They want to have their children go to school in our First Nation, because there's a lot of racism that happens in Saskatoon, Prince Albert, and the like. But today, you know, I'm telling you, if there is a way to scrap CMHC and put something in place that will work on behalf of those First Nations that are crying out for more housing, we're one of them. And I know we're probably getting about 1.5 million under the immediate needs. But there again, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of policies. We don't access direct access to that funding to start building. So today, I'm asking you, make it easy for First Nations. Don't put policies, that will, stop us from accessing more housing in our communities. And even that, it's just a slow process. I don't think we'll ever catch up, with the backlog that we have today. So, your government needs to do a better job, in addressing housing needs in our community. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. And I had closed the speakers list, so the final speaker at microphone number 1.
Miigwech. Thank you, Minister Hajdu, for the presentation to us today. My name is Lynn Akus. I'm Chief of Sagamay Anishinaabe in Treaty 4. And I want to bring up 2 issues. one of which is the designation of Treaty 4 lands. I've been, since Minister Bennett and now Minister Miller, I've been asking for some kind of willingness to either develop new legislation to deal with shared land. There's 34 First Nations that are that's our land base for Treaty 4. We're all owners of that land, and we're told that in order to designate the land, we would have to hold 34 successful designation votes. In order to be able, each First Nation would have to hold a designation vote successfully. That's impossible. And so last year at our Treaty 4 gathering, the elders and the Chiefs Council told us, well, we'll just go ahead and develop it. But we cannot issue long-term leases that can be brought to the bank for any developments on our land there. So, and there's other shared lands like Kanukamau, IR 80A in Treaty 4, and now the Capion Purchase by Treaty 1. So there's a big need to develop our shared reserve land. The other thing I want to mention is that we have reserve land bordering the city of Regina, and we've managed to begin to develop 40 acres of land west of Regina, and we see the need to have housing for our urban members in Regina, but the cost of getting municipal services there, water and sewer, is prohibitive because it's greenfield development.
30 seconds.
So we would like to see a greater commitment to helping us access the homeless funding in the future. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Chief. So I'll turn it over to Minister Hajdu to respond and some final comments. So maybe you can take the podium, actually.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you very much. On the issue of correspondence and not getting a correspondence back, that's unacceptable. And I have heard that a number of times, actually, in this last couple days. And I've already tasked the department and my ministerial team to understand why that's happening, because there should be a service standard that you get a response. You might not always love the response you get, but you deserve a response when you write to the minister's office, and I can't understand why that isn't happening. And so we're going to fix that. And what I want you to do is, when you have written to me and you're not hearing back, to connect with my political team, because we'll be monitoring really closely to see if those kinds of complaints are decreasing. It's unacceptable, quite frankly. In terms of, people talked about the treaty right to education, aging schools, infrastructure in general, the CMHC being too cumbersome. Certainly have heard that comment before. Those are those social determinants of health that I'm talking about that we have to do better together. I know that we have more work to do over the next couple of years with some of the budgetary amounts for infrastructure that we currently have at Indigenous Services Canada, and we're looking to make sure that we can get those monies spent as quickly as possible on projects all across the country, but we're going to have to go back and get more if we want to close the gap by 2030. 2030, the goal, as you know, and National Chief, I saw your comments in the media, and they're not wrong. We asked a gap assessment, to have a gap assessment by all of you to be submitted to me, the Minister of Indigenous Services, so that I could begin to quantify what kinds of financial investments we're going to have to make to close that gap by 2030. And it is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And I want to thank all of you, because I know that it was extra work for you to do that, but it gave me as the minister at least a roadmap about what kinds of investments financially we're going to have to make to close that gap. And now we have to be thoughtful as a government about how we're going to do that. So there's a lot of work underway. We're exploring a number of different ways that we can leverage monies that we receive through finance and through Treasury Board, and we're going to continue that work, because if we don't actually accelerate, the gap will never get closed. And 2030 is only 7 years away, so we have a lot of work to do. Finally, on Treaty 4 lands, I don't have an answer for you, but I will commit to speaking with Minister Miller about your very specific issues, and so one of us will get back to you, and certainly my ministerial team is here somewhere taking details, so they'll reach out to you. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Minister Hajdu. We have a gift for you, and as always, I want to make note that we have some baby slippers for you. And Patty, I've known you a long time. I can't see you. You're behind me. I've known you for so many years, long before you were a minister. And I know you have a good heart, and I know you will honor our children, help us to bring justice to our children and our families, and I thank you for your work.